What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back in the video. We're in the heart of draft season, so I figured it'd be a good idea. Take a look at my rankings, see who's been rising and falling the most over the last few weeks or so. First up, Josh Jacobs. Obviously, he signs a new contract, and so he's going to go up in the rankings because the risk that he doesn't play this season is eliminated. I now have him up to 16th overall. All the overalls I'm going to talk about today are in half PPR scoring, but point with Jacobs would be it doesn't change that much. Whether you're in standard and standard running backs are just always going to be higher in that general range because you need running backs. But half PPR, full PPR, he's good at receptions. He's not, Christian McCaffrey, but he's also not like someone who's not getting any. So half PPR, full PPR, he's going to be in that general range. That mid-second round is just a good spot to get Josh Jacobs this year. He's been running back 7 overall right now. Kind of talked about this in the Monday video. There are basically now 18 elite players, and he's right kind of at the end of that last running back in that elite top 18 before we kind of get a drop off into the late second round. And so now again, the holdout risk is gone. The risk that he's just not going to play this season, that's eliminated. Now we got to be taking him where he would be before. Some people will kind of argue there's some risk with Zamir White. Zamir White's been getting a little bit of hype. Maybe you're scared that, White's been playing well, that whether they're frustrated with Jacobs or just that, White's been playing well enough to just earn snaps. I don't really buy the Zamir White hype. I think that was more hype for them to leverage Jacobs. They were never going to come out and be like, yeah, these backups stink, we really need them, right? That's just giving all the leverage to Jacobs. So I feel like most of the Zamir White hype was just them doing that, being like, well, we're probably going to be fine, even though Zamir White showed us last season that he wasn't that amazing. I was high on him last year. I'm not buying into it. So yeah, mid-second round pick for Jacobs. I think that makes sense. I would not be hesitant about drafting him this season. Joe Mixon also moved up to 33rd overall as a running back 13. I still don't think he's going to be efficient. And remember, we've talked plenty about how if you look at his per game numbers last season, it is hyperinflated by one career game. I understand that, well, he's capable of that, and so we like him, but it's a career game over 50 fantasy points. It's just not going to happen again. Even if he'd had a really, really good game, he would perform at or worse than this ADP over the stretch. So even if you took that career game and you made it just a really, really good one, he's not some significant value from what he was doing last season. I think the larger case for him isn't that, though. It's, well, Samaje Perine's actually pretty good, and he's better than we thought that he was. And so if we look at the backups now, no one's really proven anything. Chase Brown has not proven that he can be a quality backup yet. I mean, he's still very, very young, but right now, he's not going to earn very many touches. I just don't buy into Chris Evans hype. I don't think that's ever going to be a thing. And so you look at these backups, Travion Williams, they're nothing. And so Mixon's probably going to get all the touches he can handle, all the receptions, all the touchdown opportunities on a very, very good offense. And so I was probably a little bit too low on him before. Again, only up to 33, running back 13. I think that's a really good range to get him. But yeah, end of round 3 is probably a solid spot for Joe Mixon. I had him closer into that 4th round range before. Dameon Pierce have also moved up now to 40th overall, running back 16. I've always been very high on him, always been ahead of ADP. He's one of my most rostered running backs this season, but I'm just all in at this point. Everything we saw in the preseason just shows he's going to have elite usage. That is red zone usage. That is reception upside. That is just total volume. So he's not just going to be a reception hog. He's going to have probably north of 250 carries as well. The offensive line is better this season. The defense is better this season. They're going to win more this season. Everything points to him having a breakout this season. The coaching staff has talked him up. Beat reporters are ensuring us, Singletary's only going to be not a scat back, but a change of pace back. And also, one thing beat reporters brought up that they didn't necessarily say, but they talked about how complex the scheme kind of is. And that even more plays into the fact that it's Devin Singletary is just coming over this season. If it took, a full year for Dameon Pierce to really get comfortable with the system, get comfortable with the playbook, it's probably going to take a while for Devin Singletary, who just came over in the offseason, to learn everything. So I just think everything points to Dameon Pierce. Honestly, I think he finishes a running back 1 this season, and in most platforms, you're getting him way later than that. Darren Waller, I've moved up to 51st overall as the tight end 4, still 1 spot behind TJ Hawkinson, who is 50th overall. I've talked about how maybe I'm going to move Waller over Hawkinson. I think the larger point between those two is I prefer Waller given ADP. Like Hawkinson's ADP is still a pretty good chunk ahead of Waller's. And so even though I have them back to back, straight up, I think I'm taking Hawkinson. They're going at different spots in the draft. And because I value them virtually the same, I think it's 0.4 points in half PPR, a little bit more in full PPR is the difference there. Because I value them so close together, I wouldn't draft Hawkinson. I'd wait a little bit and then draft Darren Waller. Everything, again, there's nothing that's pointing to Waller having a bad year besides injury, but we're not here to predict injury. We don't know who's going to get injured this season. I have him projected for 103 targets. I think that's being conservative, honestly. I think he could easily push past 115, 120. He looks fantastic this summer. The connection is there. The offense is rolling. Like, everything points to Waller having another breakout this year. And again, we got to do our best not to predict injuries. Yes, he's been injured in the past, but so was McCaffrey before going off last season. So was Saquon before going off last season. So was someone like Keenan Allen early in his career before he puts together a string of, perfectly healthy seasons. Like, football is just a tough sport, and sometimes people get injured. That's just kind of the way it is. No one's going out there super duper injury prone unless you're maybe like Rashad Penny. Like, maybe that's the difference there, but the point is we cannot just predict an injury with Waller, and if he stays healthy, he's going to smash. So why should we not be drafting him heavily? I've also moved up all Steelers players in general. So basically every single player on the Steelers I've moved up. But I would say the biggest bumps were to Najee, not necessarily a big bump, only 3 spots, but because it was so early, that's a meaningful bump, I guess, up to pick 31. Deontay Johnson only up 2 spots to 63. Pickens, I moved up around to 73rd overall. And then Jaylen Warren, I've moved up about a round to 115th overall. So biggest increases would be Pickens and Warren. Biggest change I made was increasing efficiency a little bit because they looked good in the preseason. Reports out of camp are good, but then also touchdowns. And that's why Deontay didn't go up as much as Pickens did, because Pickens I have projected for a larger share given targets. So like Deontay is going to have a ton of targets, great in full PPR, but he doesn't have a huge, share of the touchdowns, right? Pickens, I expect to score a decent amount of touchdowns. So when I up the touchdown projection, he's going to benefit a little bit more. Also, Pickens kind of goes in the range where there's a lot more room to fluctuate because a lot of those players are projected very similarly. Point is, I'm in on the Steelers a little bit more now. I've definitely been too off on them. I've talked about that over the last week or so that I've been gaining more confidence. And I would say, like, if I'm in, my main redraft league right now, or let's say 2 months ago, unlikely I draft anyone other than Jaylen Warren. I've been in on Jaylen Warren all summer, but I was out on Najee, out on Deontay, out on Pickens just because they were kind of going a little bit too early. At this point, if I was drafting right now in my main redraft league, I'd be comfortable taking all of them. I would say Najee I'd like the least because I like Warren so much, because I wouldn't really want to draft both of them. And so taking Najee, I'd have to do it at value because it's like, well, now I don't get Warren late, which is a person I really, really like. So not in love with Najee, but much more willing to take him now because I think the offense is going to be better. I would say similar thing with Pickens and Deontay. Like, I'd prefer Pickens a little bit later as opposed to Deontay, but I would still draft both of them if either one became a value, definitely. I would say full PPR. Like full PPR, I'm leaning towards Deontay. Half PPR standard, you're leaning more towards George Pickens. And then Kenny Pickett, I don't have graded out as some value, but he's around ADP. And I think if you got to that spot, especially for those in super flex leagues, I think he's a perfectly fine pick to make. If you want to bet on this offense, you got Pickens, you're in super flex, you want him as your second quarterback, absolutely fine drafting Kenny Pickett. Last riser we're going to go over is Khalil Herbert, someone that I've talked about a lot, liking over the last 2 years, right? Like last season, we were in on Herbert. I thought he was a very good talent, wasn't getting enough of a workload. Was high on him coming into the summer, so we got some early ADP value on him. But then I kind of backed off. I was getting a little bit scared of people liked Foreman. I've always had Foreman tanked in the rankings, but I don't know. Part of me was just scared that maybe everyone else was right and that Foreman was going to be good or something. Probably shouldn't have listened to that, but haven't had that factor in too much. It's more been Roschon Johnson, right? I think Roschon is like a good player, and I don't think that he's necessarily going to step in week 1 and be better than Khalil Herbert, right? Like, I think over time, potentially that could happen. But I guess that was one risk, that over time that could happen. The second risk was that we know Khalil Herbert's not a great pass blocker and not good in the receiving game. And we know that Roschon could be. And it turns out in camp that he was. He's great in pass protection. He's good in the receiving game. So he's probably going to be a third down back. And so I was looking at Herbert being like, well, if they don't throw running backs anyways, and he's not getting those snaps, like he's gonna have a lot of games where he has like 17 carries and no targets. And now you have to have 100 touchdowns because, like, how am I starting you if you're not scoring when you have 0 receptions as well? You need, over 120 rushing yards to be worth the play at that point. And so that's why I kind of backed off. But if we look at the preseason usage, he's pretty clearly their top running back. He's been performing well. And again, I think the talent is there. I think the offense will be pretty decent. And so I'm back on him. I moved him up, but I would not consider him a target. So definitely fine drafting him right now. I've seen some teams, people who are using the rankings that have gotten to him. So it gives me confidence that I don't have to take too far. I'm still a little bit behind ADP. But again, I'm more willing to draft him now than I was about a month ago. Looking at some fallers. I dropped J.K. Dobbins, but I wanted to talk about this one because it's not really Dobbins' fault. It really just was players around him. I moved like Dameon Pierce up, did Montgomery, Christian Watson, Darren Waller. So just like those people moved ahead of him. So even if I didn't change the Dobbins rankings, now you're down 4. I dropped his projection just a little bit, but that was enough to bump him down behind Aaron Jones, behind Ken Walker for running backs, then behind a few wide receivers as well. So it really was just other people went up. He went down just a little bit, but that happened to bump him down, a decent chunk because there's a lot of players with a very similar projection and that range. Still like him a lot. Still think he's talented. Still like this offense. So I'm not out on Dobbins, and I still have him ahead of ADP. But I wanted to say, why he was down 10 spots there. It wasn't really anything that he did. It was more just like situations around him. But then again, I dropped it just a little bit because I was probably just a little bit too in on his production. I do think they're going to spread the ball around a decent amount. Lamar's going to run it plenty. Even though they have a ton of production in the backfield, it's not necessarily like a top 5 offense for fantasy points for running backs. They'll be highly efficient, but fantasy points wise, Lamar takes so much that, and they don't, throw to the running backs all that much. They will a little bit more this season, but they don't throw it to him enough to where it's like the split will be okay, if that makes sense. Like they're still going to use other running backs. It's not some prolific backfield. So dropped him just a little bit. I was too overconfident, but still like him. Other player dropped was Christian Kirk, down 8 spots to pick 62. That one as well, still a little bit ahead of ADP. I think Dobbins, I'm like 2 or 3 picks ahead of ADP. Same thing with Kirk. That drop was because I dropped, I think he's going to be projected for fewer routes run than last season. So that won't be a huge impact. His snap share is definitely going to drop because he's not going to play in 3 wide receiver sets. So they're going to have Ridley and Zay Jones on the outside and 2 wide receiver sets. Obviously, 1 wide receiver set's going to have Ridley on the outside. And so total snaps are going down. That's not a big issue because a lot of the snaps that he's not going to play are run plays. Who cares if Kirk's not out there for run plays? I don't score fantasy points from those anyways. But some of them won't be run plays. And so he will suffer a little bit because if he's not out there, he can't score fantasy points. And so that's why I dropped him a little bit. Again, it was a very small drop, just down 8 spots. But it was basically saying, okay, I'm close to a round ahead of ADP, but now I'm noticing something that he's not going to be on the field as much. They have this true alpha there. Even though I love the offense and I want to be ahead of ADP on Christian Kirk, I don't want to be too far ahead of ADP. So that's why I dropped him. Also dropped, Jeudy because obviously you have to, suffering the major hamstring injury. We don't know a lot. It's tough to know exactly where to rank him because we don't have a lot of information because they don't need to tell us information right now until we get into the season. We don't have practice reports. We don't have, game reports. They don't have to say he's questionable or doubtful. They don't have to do these things. They don't have to tell us anything. And so we're kind of just going off of a little bit what we know about the injury, which isn't great, right? It's a hamstring injury, high re-injury risk. I'm more confident about Cooper Kupp. So some people ask about the comparison there, why I'm not super concerned about Kupp. Well, number 1, Kupp's already back practicing, right? Jeudy's not, he's going to be out for a while. But number 2, Kupp had time. And so I'm not concerned about a hamstring injury, for Mims had a hamstring injury earlier in camp. But both Mims and Cooper Kupp have had a lot of time to slowly recover and not rush back. Whereas I think there's a risk that given how bad the hamstring injury is and how it's going to push into the season, there's a risk that Jeudy returns just a little bit too early because he's like, oh, yeah, I'm fine. We got to get out there. I'm in game shape. Let's go. And he pushes it just a little too early and suffers a re-injury, and that would be very, very bad. Whereas, again, Mims had plenty of time. They took it easy on him. Cooper Kupp, plenty of time to recover for week 1. I just think there's less time for Jeudy, and so it just increases the risk for me. And when you also think, Sutton's having a good camp. I like Mims a lot. Why do I need to be ahead of Jerry Jeudy coming off a major injury? It just doesn't, not a major injury, but an injury that causes us a lot of concern. I don't like hamstring injuries for wide receivers, especially because they hit that top speed so much more often, such a high re-injury risk because of that. So again, that's kind of why I dropped him. Also dropped Cam Akers down nearly 2 rounds to 76 overall. I drafted a decent amount of him earlier in the offseason, but I'm out on him now. I kind of just looked at it and was like, well, who's really going to compete with him, right? Even though it's a very bad backfield for fantasy production, if no one's competing with him, he's getting all those touches, all those fantasy points, it's going to be good, right? Now it looks like he's headed for a timeshare with Kyren Williams. And again, like I kind of said before, it's a backfield that scored nothing last year. I mean, they scored the fewest fantasy points in the league last season, and I'm not expecting that to be a whole lot different, right? I mean, they're still going to be a bad team. They're going to be down a lot, and that hurts running backs because they have to throw it a ton, and it's not like they're going to dink and dump to Cam Akers a ton. I mean, he's probably not even passing down back. So when they're losing all these games in the second half, it's probably Kyren Williams that's out there getting all those snaps. So that's not good. You compare them to a backfield like Detroit, right? Detroit has a split. Why do I still like them? Well, Gibbs and Montgomery are fine in a split because that backfield's a gold mine for fantasy production. But as I mentioned before, the Rams scored no fantasy points last season. And it's just a crazy stat I talked about maybe a month ago is like the Lions running backs could have scored -7 touchdowns last season and still outscored Rams running backs. So everyone talks about, they got lucky with touchdowns. They could have scored -7, still outscored the Rams. It's not a good backfield for fantasy production. And again, now I think it's going to be a split, with the bad part of the split being Akers. Plus, we have this whole thing of he's a good player, he's young, but it's like we have these weird things where they're just not using him, not fully committed. I don't know. I think his ADP kind of assumes they're more committed than they are, and so I'm out on that. Final player that I dropped in the rankings is Jameson Williams. Over a round into the 120s. I'm recording this Monday, and I'm just very curious if they're going to add a receiver over the next 2 days. I think that it's a possibility that Detroit trades for a wide receiver. I don't really have a take on who that's going to be, but I think it's possible. They're not happy with their wide receiver room right now. And I think they're frustrated with Jameson Williams. Obviously, he's suspended for 6 weeks, so that's going to hurt in general anyways. But he hasn't really shown that he can stay healthy. He hasn't shown he can command a consistent target share, and he hasn't shown he can be efficient in the receiving game. Every time he goes out there, it's like he catches 1 of 5 targets for 20 yards, right? So I think they're a little bit frustrated with him. And if there's a chance that they trade for someone, if there's a chance that maybe his role isn't as good as we're thinking, I just didn't want to be too far ahead of ADP because the ADP is also definitely trending down right now. So we'll see what happens. You guys will actually potentially know before this video gets uploaded if there actually has been a trade there. But even if that doesn't happen, I'm getting a little bit weary with how much I really want to roster him for 6 weeks and then see what I have in him. That's a long time. And so I think the risk was a little bit too high. I had to move him down in the rankings. So that is it for the biggest changes over the last, 2 or 3 weeks or so. If you want to see my exact rankings on every single player, you can see that on my website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. And if you want to see that for free, all you got to do is sign up for your first Underdog account today using promo code FFA. Do that and deposit at least $10 into your account, and they will not only match that first deposit up to $100. So you put in $75, they'll turn it into $150. You can get in a ton of free drafts after that. But also, the following morning, I will email you login information to my website. You see that you're going to have access to the redraft rankings, my Underdog rankings, all Underdog content all season long, and then my top 60 must-draft players this season. But that'll do it for this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting the like button, and how about subscribing to the channel if you're new here? Thanks for watching.